You have exactly 15 minutes before your heart pumps its last drop of blood onto this elevator floor. You can either shoot me or let me cut you open with this broken glass. For Maya, it was supposed to be a simple late-night delivery. But when the city's most ruthless mafia boss stumbled into her elevator, bleeding out and hunted by assassins, the steel cage did not just become a trap. It became the birthplace of a dark, unbreakable bond. The rain was coming down in sheets, washing the grime off the streets of Boston, but doing nothing to clean the city's rotten core. Maya stood shivering inside the polished brass and glass elevator of the Empire Building, staring blankly at the glowing numbers as they ticked upward. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. Her yellow delivery jacket was soaked, clinging to her tired shoulders, the weight of the rain mirroring the crushing weight of her reality. She was 24 years old, $300,000 in debt, and a medical school dropout thanks to a loan shark who had decided her father's gambling problem was now her physical burden. She was existing in pure survival mode, trading her scrubs for a delivery bag just to keep her kneecaps intact. The doors were just about to slide shut at the lobby when a hand shot through the gap. The thick metal doors violently reversed on their tracks, groaning in protest. A man stepped inside. He did not look like the kind of man who belonged in the mundane world of midnight food deliveries. He wore a bespoke midnight blue suit that easily cost more than Maya's entire medical school tuition. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain, and his jaw was set in a line of pure, hardened steel. But it was his eyes that made Maya stop breathing. They were dark, bottomless, and entirely devoid of human warmth. They were the eyes of an apex predator scanning a forest for threats, calculating who lived and who died in a fraction of a second. He leaned heavily against the brass railing, his breathing irregular and ragged. Maya smelled it before she saw it. Beneath the scent of the cold rain and his expensive cedarwood cologne, there was the sharp, unmistakable metallic stench of fresh blood. It was pooling at his feet, dripping in a steady, rhythmic rhythm from the sleeve of his expensive jacket onto the pristine floor. This was Dante Romano, the devil of the Boston Syndicate, the man who owned the shadows of the city, the man whose subordinates held Maya's crushing debt, and right now, the untouchable king was dying in a metal box. Before Maya could even process the primal urge to run, the elevator lurched violently. They were 40 floors above the concrete pavement when the lights suddenly died. The hum of the mechanics ground to a sickening, abrupt halt. The steel box swayed, suspended by cables in the dark, plunging them into absolute, suffocating blackness. A heavy silence pressed against Maya's eardrums, followed immediately by the terrifying sensation of gravity shifting as the brakes locked in place. A second later, the blood-red emergency lights flickered on, casting a macabre, hellish glow over the tiny space. Maya lunged for the emergency panel, her hand trembling violently as it flew toward the red call button. Stop. The voice was a low, guttural rasp, barely more than a whisper, but it commanded the room with the crushing force of a physical blow. Maya froze, her fingers mere millimeters from the button. She turned around slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Dante had slipped down the wall, leaving a thick, dark smear of blood against the polished brass. His legs had finally given out under his massive frame, but his right hand was perfectly, terrifyingly steady. He was holding a 9mm pistol, and the black barrel was pointed directly at the center of her forehead. "If you make a sound," he breathed, his broad chest heaving with the agonizing effort of speaking, "I will put a bullet through your skull." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The fear was paralyzing, a cold wave washing over her skin and freezing the blood in her veins. She looked at the dark muzzle of the gun, then at the man holding it. The ultimate alpha of the underworld, reduced to a bleeding mess on a linoleum floor, yet still gripping his power with a terrifying, absolute desperation. He was a man who would gladly drag her down to hell with him just to maintain his control. But as Maya stared at the dark stains soaking through his crisp white shirt, spreading rapidly just beneath his left collarbone, something deep inside her fractured. The terrified, overworked delivery girl who had spent the last 2 years cowering from violent men slowly began to vanish. In the suffocating red glow of the trapped elevator, the brilliant trauma surgeon she was meant to be woke up. She did not scream. She did not beg for her life. She listened. Above them, through the thick steel ceiling of the elevator, came a sound that made her stomach drop. A heavy, metallic scrape. The unmistakable sound of tactical boots landing softly on the metal roof of their cage. Then came the muffled, high-pitched hum of an industrial drill biting into steel. He was not threatening her to keep her from calling the police. He was threatening her because the men who put the bullet in his chest were standing right above their heads, hunting him down to finish the job. If she pressed the emergency button, the intercom would ring out, echoing through the elevator shaft, painting a massive auditory target on their exact location. Maya looked down at the puddle of blood expanding rapidly around Dante's expensive leather shoes. The pool was growing by the second. She forced her eyes back up to the wound. She did the math in her head, analyzing the color of the arterial blood, the terrifyingly pale shade of his lips, the rapid, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was trying to project dominance, but his body was entering the first stages of hypovolemic shock. "You are not going to shoot me," Maya said. Her voice was eerily calm, a quiet, steady force that surprised even herself in the claustrophobic red darkness. Dante's eyes narrowed, a flicker of dangerous, lethal curiosity cutting through his agonizing pain. His finger twitched on the trigger, a silent warning. "Because if you pull that trigger, the noise will tell the men on the roof exactly where we are," she continued, slowly pulling her hand away from the control panel and taking a deliberate step toward the barrel of his gun. "And even if they do not reach us in time, the bullet clipped your subclavian artery. You are losing a pint of blood every 4 minutes. Your brain is already starving for oxygen, which is why your hand is starting to shake." Dante's jaw tightened. The barrel of the 9mm dipped a fraction of an inch, not out of mercy, but out of failing muscle control. He stared at the girl in the soaked yellow jacket, his predatory mind struggling to process her total lack of submission. Everyone begged. Everyone cowered. But this girl was looking at his gunshot wound like a mechanic looking at a broken engine. "You do not have the luxury of killing me, Mr. Romano," Maya whispered, dropping to her knees right in front of the gun, her hazel eyes locking directly onto his fading, dangerous gaze. "You have exactly 15 minutes to live, and I am the only person in this metal box who knows how to stop it. Now put the gun down, or we both die in the dark." The heavy silence in the suspended elevator was broken only by the ragged, wet sound of Dante's breathing. His dark eyes, clouded with pain and the creeping fog of blood loss, stared down the barrel of the 9mm pistol. But Maya did not blink. She kept her gaze locked on his, projecting a calm certainty she did not truly feel. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy steel of the gun began to dip. His muscles were failing. "Do not mistake this for trust," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper as the weapon slipped from his grip, clattering against the blood-soaked floor. "I do not need your trust, Mr. Romano," Maya replied, her voice steady in the oppressive red darkness. "I just need you to stay conscious." She moved closer, sliding to her knees beside him. The metallic smell of blood was overwhelming now. She reached out, her trembling fingers gripping the lapels of his ruined, bespoke jacket. As she pulled the fabric back, Dante let out a sharp, involuntary hiss. His hand shot out with terrifying speed, his cold, blood-stained fingers clamping around her slender wrist like a vice. "No one touches me," he breathed. The paranoia of a man hunted his entire life, flaring violently in his fading eyes. Maya looked down at his grip, then back up to his face. The power dynamic in the tiny steel cage was shifting, tipping precariously away from the untouchable king and falling entirely into the hands of the terrified delivery girl. "You can hold on to your pride," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, uncompromising whisper, "but you are going to bleed out on this linoleum floor in less than 10 minutes. The bullet did not exit. It is lodged right behind your collarbone, millimeters away from your subclavian artery. If the swelling increases, it will compress your windpipe. You will choke on your own blood. So, you can either shoot me, or you can let me cut that bullet out. Choose right now." Dante stared at her. For 5 long seconds, the only sound was the distant, muffled grinding of the assassins drilling through the elevator ceiling, 50 feet above them. Slowly, his grip on her wrist loosened. His hand fell away. It was a surrender. the devil yielding his life to a medical school dropout. Maya did not waste another second. She turned away from him and looked around the confined space. There was no first aid kit. There were no surgical tools. There was only the polished brass, the flickering red emergency lights, and a decorative mirror panel on the back wall of the elevator. She stood up, unlaced her heavy work boot, and swung it with every ounce of desperate strength she had. The mirror shattered with a deafening crash, raining hundreds of jagged, reflective shards onto the floor. Dante watched through half-closed eyes as Maya knelt among the broken glass, carefully selecting a long, triangular shard with a perfectly tapered, razor-sharp edge. It was a scalpel made of desperation. She turned back to her delivery bag, ripping open the soaked paper sack. Inside, next to a container of cold noodles, was a large bottle of cheap, 80-proof vodka. She unscrewed the cap and turned back to the mob boss. "I need a fire," she said. Dante reached into the pocket of his trousers with trembling, bloodied fingers. He pulled out a heavy, solid gold Zippo lighter and tossed it onto the floor between them. Maya picked it up. Her thumb flicked the wheel. A bright, steady orange flame erupted, casting dancing shadows against the elevator walls. She poured a generous splash of the clear alcohol over the glass shard, then ran the jagged edge through the fire. The glass hissed, the chemical smell of burning alcohol mixing with the metallic scent of blood. She knelt over him again, the sterilized shard gripped firmly between her thumb and forefinger. The red emergency light illuminated the pale, terrifying intensity on her face. "I have no anesthesia, Mr. Romano," Maya whispered, her voice softening for the very first time. "I have to make a 2-inch incision to reach the bullet, and I have to go deep. It is going to feel like pure fire. If you move, if you thrash, I will sever the artery, and you will die in seconds. Do you understand me?" Dante leaned his head back against the cold brass wall. The sweat was beading on his forehead, his face pale as a ghost, but the dark intensity in his eyes never wavered. He did not nod. He simply looked at her, his gaze stripping away the delivery jacket, seeing only the raw, brilliant surgeon hiding beneath the debt and the fear. "Cut," he commanded. Maya pressed the jagged tip of the mirror shard against his burning, blood-slicked skin. She took a deep breath, steadying her shaking hand, and applied pressure. The glass sliced through his flesh. Dante's entire massive frame went rigid. The muscles in his neck strained against the skin, thick veins bulging as his body fought the agonizing trauma of unmedicated surgery. His jaw clamped shut with enough force to crack his own teeth. He bit down so hard on his bottom lip that fresh, bright red blood began to spill down his chin. But he did not make a single sound. He did not scream. He did not flinch. His eyes stayed locked entirely on Maya. In the terrifying, agonizing darkness, as a girl he did not even know buried a piece of a broken mirror into his chest. The ruthless king of the Boston underworld felt something he had not felt in 20 years. He felt safe. The metallic clink of the bullet hitting the brass floor echoed in the suffocating darkness. Maya let out a ragged breath, her hands slick with Dante's blood. She immediately pressed a wad of sterile napkins from her delivery bag against the open wound, leaning her entire body weight into his chest to stop the bleeding. Dante did not move. His eyes were closed, his head tilted back against the cold wall. The adrenaline that had kept him rigidly conscious during the brutal, unmedicated surgery was fading, replaced by the terrifying, inevitable crash of his nervous system. Maya felt the sudden, violent tremor rip through his massive frame. It started in his shoulders and quickly consumed his whole body. His skin, already pale from blood loss, was turning a dangerous shade of gray. He was going into thermal shock. The storm outside was raging, and the broken elevator shaft was acting like a wind tunnel, pulling the freezing night air into the metal box. The temperature was dropping rapidly. "Stay with me," Maya commanded, her voice cracking for the first time. "Dante, open your eyes." His heavy eyelids fluttered, revealing dark irises that were losing their lethal focus. The edges of his lips were turning blue. His core temperature was plummeting, and without medical supplies, hypothermia would kill him just as surely as the bullet would have. Maya did not hesitate. She unzipped her yellow delivery jacket and threw it aside, leaving only her thin, worn sweater. The air bit into her skin, but she ignored it. She grabbed the thick, expensive wool coat that Dante had discarded earlier and pulled it tightly around his shaking shoulders. It was not enough. He was freezing from the inside out. She moved closer, sliding her body directly against his, wrapping her arms around his torso to transfer whatever body heat she could. Her ear was pressed against his chest, listening to the erratic, weakened thumping of his heart. "Talk to me," she demanded, her voice muffled against his damp shirt. "I need you awake. Who shot you? Who is on the roof?" A bitter, almost imperceptible laugh rattled in Dante's throat. The sound was hollow, laced with a darkness that made the freezing elevator feel even colder. "The wolves I fed," he whispered, every word a struggle. "My own men. Matteo. He was my second in command. My brother in arms for 15 years. He sold the security codes. He orchestrated the hit." Maya felt a shiver run down her own spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She was holding on to the most feared man in Boston, a man who commanded an army of killers. And yet, in this dark, suspended cage, he was just as betrayed and vulnerable as she was. "Why?" she asked, keeping her voice steady, pressing harder against his chest. Why would he betray the king of the syndicate? "Power," Dante murmured, his head lolling slightly to the side until his cold cheek rested against her hair. "There is always someone hungry for the crown. The underworld does not tolerate weakness. They think I have grown soft. They think the empire is ripe for the taking." Maya scoffed, a bitter, cynical sound escaping her lips before she could stop it. "Soft? Your syndicate destroys families for fun. Your men do not know the meaning of the word soft." Dante shifted slightly, the pain in his chest making him grimace, but the sharpness returned to his eyes for a fleeting second. He looked down at the girl clinging to him in the dark. "You speak with a lot of anger for a delivery girl," he noted, his breathing shallow, but his mind sharp enough to catch the raw venom in her voice. "Who hurt you, Maya?" She tightened her grip on him, her fingernails digging slightly into the fabric of his coat. "You did. Or at least, your empire did." Dante was silent, waiting. The hum of the storm outside seemed to fade into the background. "My father was a gambling addict," Maya continued, the words spilling out in a rush, fueled by years of exhaustion and quiet terror. "He borrowed $50,000 from a man named Carmine. Carmine works for the Romano syndicate. Your syndicate. The debt grew to $300,000 in 2 years because of the interest. When my father could not pay, they broke his legs. Then they came to my medical school. They told me I was the guarantor. If I did not drop out and start paying them every single week, they would kill him and sell me." The silence that followed her confession was absolute. The only sound was the drip of blood and the ragged breathing of 2 people trapped in the dark. Maya expected him to ignore it, to dismiss her pain as collateral damage in his massive, ruthless machine. But Dante reached up with his uninjured arm. His cold, blood-stained fingers gently grasped her chin, tilting her face up so her hazel eyes met his. The terrifying, predatory alpha was gone, replaced by a man looking at a mirror image of his own broken world. She was a victim of the very monster he had created. "Carmine," Dante repeated, the name rolling off his tongue like a death sentence. "He runs the South End operation. Matteo's territory." "Yes," Maya whispered, trembling slightly under his intense gaze. Dante's thumb brushed lightly against her cheek. The movement was devastatingly gentle, a shocking contrast to the violence that defined his existence. His eyes burned with a dark, unyielding fire, the fever and the pain momentarily pushed aside by pure, absolute resolve. "If you keep my heart beating until the sun comes up, Maya," he swore, his voice a low, lethal rumble that vibrated through her chest. "If you get me out of this steel coffin alive, I will not just erase your debt. I will bring you Carmine's head on a silver platter. No one who belongs to me will ever have to run again." Maya's breath hitched. In the freezing, blood-soaked darkness of the elevator, the devil had just offered her a contract. And as the distant, terrifying sound of a metal grinder started up again on the roof above them, she knew she was going to sign it. The silence that followed Dante's promise was shattered by a sound that tore through the steel ceiling like a screaming banshee. The high-pitched whine of the industrial grinder was no longer distant. It was right on top of them. The assassins had breached the outer shaft and were now cutting directly into the elevator car. A shower of bright orange sparks cascaded through a newly formed gap in the ceiling panel, illuminating the cramped, blood-soaked box in chaotic flashes of light. The sparks landed on the floor, sizzling against the pooling blood. Maya scrambled backward, pulling Dante with her until their backs were pressed hard against the brass wall. Dante's breathing grew ragged again. The sheer physical exertion of staying conscious was draining the last reserves of his strength. Then, the grinding stopped. For 5 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the storm raging outside the building. Maya stared up at the thin, jagged slice of darkness torn into the ceiling. She expected a gun barrel to push through. She expected a hail of bullets. Instead, there was a soft, mechanical hiss. A thick, heavy white smoke began to pour through the crack, cascading down the walls like a waterfall of ice. The moment the vapor hit Maya's lungs, her throat seized. It was not smoke from a fire. It was a concentrated, military-grade chemical agent. The gas burned her eyes, filling her chest with a searing, suffocating heat that made her gag. "They are trying to flush us out," Dante coughed, his voice barely audible over the hissing gas. He reached with his right hand, his fingers sliding across the floor until they wrapped around the grip of his discarded 9mm pistol. He tried to raise his arm, aiming the barrel toward the crack in the ceiling. His jaw locked, the veins in his neck bulging as he fought his own failing anatomy. But his muscles, starved of blood and shivering from the plunging temperature, simply refused to obey. The heavy gun shook violently in his grip before his arm collapsed, the metal hitting the floor with a dull thud. Dante cursed, a bitter, vicious sound. He turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Maya through the thickening, toxic haze. Tears were streaming down her face from the chemical burn, her hands clamped over her mouth as she choked. "Maya," Dante rasped, his voice cutting through her panic like a razor. "Pick it up." She looked at the gun, then back to him, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She shook her head. She was a medical student. Her hands were meant to mend flesh, to stitch wounds, to save lives. She had never held a firearm in her entire 24 years of existence. "Pick it up," he commanded again, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "They are going to drop a breach charge next. If they blow that ceiling, we are dead in 3 seconds. You have to shoot." Maya dropped her hands from her face. The gas was making her dizzy, her lungs screaming for oxygen. She looked at the cold, black steel of the weapon resting in a puddle of blood. The blood she had just spilled to keep him alive. If she did not pick it up, it was all for nothing. The loan shark would still own her. Her father would die, and she would suffocate in a steel box with a murdered king. With trembling fingers, Maya reached out and grabbed the pistol. It was incredibly heavy, the grip slick and warm with Dante's blood. She raised the weapon, pointing it blindly toward the ceiling, her arms shaking so violently she could barely keep the barrel straight. She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing to blindly pull the trigger. "Open your eyes," a low voice growled right beside her ear. Dante had pushed himself up, leaning his heavy, freezing body against hers. His left arm wrapped around her waist, anchoring her to him. His right hand, weak but steady with years of lethal experience, reached up and covered both of her trembling hands. He guided the gun, adjusting her grip, forcing her index finger to rest perfectly against the trigger. "Do not look at the smoke," Dante whispered, his breath hot against her neck, a stark contrast to the freezing air. "Look at the gap. They need a line of sight to drop the explosive. A shadow will cross that gap in exactly 2 seconds. When it does, you do not hesitate. You pull." Maya stared up. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to crack her ribs. The terrified girl who delivered noodles was gone, buried under the crushing weight of survival. "Breathe in," Dante instructed softly. Maya took a shallow, burning breath of the toxic air. "Hold it." A dark, solid shape blocked the orange glow of the emergency lights filtering through the crack. A silhouette of a man peering down into the elevator. Pull. Maya squeezed the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot in the enclosed metal box was catastrophic. The recoil snapped her wrists back, sending a shockwave up her arms, but Dante's hands held hers perfectly steady. The bullet tore through the thin steel paneling. A sharp, agonizing scream echoed from the roof of the elevator, followed immediately by the heavy, sickening thud of a body collapsing onto the metal surface. The shadow vanished. A second later, a thick, dark liquid began to drip through the bullet hole, splattering against the brass floor. Blood. Not Dante's blood. The blood of an assassin. Maya lowered the gun, staring at the red droplets falling from the ceiling. Her breathing was ragged, her mind reeling from the absolute, irreversible finality of what she had just done. She had taken a life. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "You did what you had to do," Dante whispered, pulling her slightly closer, sensing the psychological fracture happening inside her. "You survived." Before Maya could process his words, a horrific, groaning sound echoed through the entire elevator shaft. The dead assassin's body had collapsed directly onto the weakened, compromised section of the ceiling where they had been grinding. The added weight, combined with the structural damage from the bullet, was the final straw. A massive, thick steel cable outside the car snapped with a sound like a cannon firing. The elevator violently lurched downward. Maya screamed as gravity vanished, her stomach leaping into her throat. They were in absolute freefall. The metal box plunged through the dark shaft, tearing past floor after floor in a terrifying blur of speed and noise. Dante threw his arms around her, crushing her against his chest as they braced for the inevitable impact. 3 floors down, the emergency braking system violently engaged. The elevator slammed to a halt with a catastrophic, bone-rattling crash, throwing them both violently into the dark corner of the shattered steel cage. The impact of the crash threw Maya violently across the small metal box. Her shoulder slammed into the solid brass railing, and the side of her head struck the floor. A blinding flash of white light exploded behind her eyelids. For several seconds, the world dissolved into a high-pitched ringing and the suffocating taste of dust, copper, and chemical gas. The elevator car groaned, swaying dangerously on its secondary emergency brakes. The red lights flickered wildly before stabilizing into a dim, terrifying glow. Maya tried to push herself up, but her arms felt like lead. The air in the cab was thick and unbreathable. The ventilation system was completely dead, and the residual toxic smoke from the roof was settling heavily toward the floor. Her lungs burned with every shallow breath. She coughed, a wet, agonizing sound, and her vision began to narrow into a dark tunnel. She was suffocating. A heavy, warm hand grasped her shoulder, pulling her out of the encroaching darkness. Dante had dragged his battered, bleeding body across the shattered glass and debris. The crash had undoubtedly torn his stitches, and fresh blood was beginning to soak through his thick wool coat. But the sheer, terrifying force of his will kept him moving. He reached her, sliding his uninjured arm under her back, and hauled her up against his chest. "Breathe," he ordered, his voice a ragged, desperate rasp. "I cannot," Maya choked out, her head falling limply against his collarbone. "There is no air." She was right. The oxygen in the suspended coffin was depleting by the second. Dante looked up at the ceiling. The hole they had shot through was now completely blocked by the dead weight of the assassin's body. They were sealed in. Dante shifted his weight, pulling Maya entirely into his lap. He leaned back against the corner of the elevator, spreading his large frame over her to shield her from the heaviest concentration of the settling gas. He pressed her face into the curve of his neck, right against his bare skin, where the air was marginally cleaner, filtered by the fabric of his coat. "Do not close your eyes, Maya," he whispered, his lips brushing against her hair. "Look at me." Maya forced her heavy eyelids open. The ruthless king of the Boston underworld was looking down at her, his face pale and covered in a fine sheen of cold sweat, but his dark eyes were burning with a fierce, possessive intensity. He was dying. His body was failing. Yet, in this suffocating steel cage, He was pouring every ounce of his remaining strength into keeping her conscious. He reached up with his blood-stained hand. His fingers, rough and calloused from a lifetime of violence, gently brushed the loose strands of hair away from her face. His thumb trailed down her cheek, leaving a stark, vivid streak of his own crimson blood against her pale skin. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate mark. A primitive, undeniable claim in the dark. "You saved my life," Dante murmured, his breath warm against her freezing skin. "In my world, blood is a currency. It binds us. The debt your father owes is gone. The people who hurt you are dead men walking. But you do not get to save a king and walk away, Maya." Maya's heart fluttered, a weak, frantic rhythm against his chest. Her mind was spinning from the lack of oxygen, but his words pierced through the haze with absolute, terrifying clarity. "I am just a medical student," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the creaking of the metal cables. "Not anymore," Dante replied, his grip tightening around her waist, pulling her flush against his racing heart. "You are mine to protect now. Anyone who looks at you, anyone who breathes a word against you, will answer to me. You are under my shadow, and I do not let what is mine slip away in the dark." Maya stared up at the blood smeared across his harsh, beautiful face. She should have been terrified. She should have rejected the mob boss and his bloody world. But as the cold gripped her and the air grew thinner, the fear simply vanished. The streak of blood on her cheek felt like a brand, a shield forged in violence but meant solely for her protection. She lifted her trembling hand, her fingers wrapping weakly into the lapel of his shirt. She pulled herself an inch closer, burying her face into his chest, entirely surrendering to the dark, dangerous sanctuary of his embrace. "Okay," she breathed, closing her eyes as the edges of her consciousness finally began to fade. "Keep your promise." Dante rested his chin on top of her head, his eyes fixing on the steel doors of the elevator. He held the dying girl in his arms, counting every agonizing second, waiting for the devil to come and collect his due. The air in the suspended coffin grew incredibly thin. Maya did not know if they had been trapped for 20 minutes or 2 hours. Dante's breathing had become dangerously shallow, his massive chest barely rising beneath the heavy wool coat. She kept her fingers pressed tightly against the pulse point on his neck, anchoring her own sanity to the weak, erratic thumping of his heart. Then, the heavy brass doors of the elevator shuddered. A loud, metallic screech echoed through the shaft, vibrating against Maya's spine. Someone was prying the doors apart from the outside. A sliver of blinding, artificial white light pierced the red darkness of the cab, forcing Maya to squeeze her eyes shut. "Boss!" a voice shouted from the other side of the growing gap. Dante shifted in the dark, a low, painful groan escaping his lips. His dark eyes cracked open, adjusting to the sudden intrusion of light. The doors were forced completely open with a violent metallic groan. The 14th floor hallway was illuminated by emergency backup lights. Standing in the threshold, flanked by 4 heavily armed men in black tactical gear, was a tall, broad-shouldered man holding a steel crowbar. He dropped the tool and stepped into the shattered elevator. "Matteo," Dante breathed, a flicker of genuine relief crossing his pale, blood-stained face. Matteo looked down at the ruined, bleeding king of the Boston Syndicate, and then at the terrified delivery girl clutching him. His face was a mask of cold, calculated stone. "We secured the building," Matteo said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of panic. "The assassins are dead on the roof. I told the extraction team to wait in the lobby. I wanted to find you myself." Maya let out a shuddering breath, the crushing weight of survival finally lifting from her shoulders. They were saved. The nightmare was over. She moved to untangle herself from Dante so Matteo could help him up, but as she shifted, her gaze fell to the floor. Matteo had stepped into the puddle of Dante's blood, but it was not the blood that caught Maya's attention. It was the heavy tactical boots Matteo was wearing. They were coated in a thick, dark layer of industrial grease, the exact same grease that had dripped through the ceiling panel along with the dead assassin's blood. And beneath the scent of gunpowder and expensive cologne, Maya's highly trained medical senses picked up a faint, sharp chemical odor radiating from Matteo's clothes. It was the exact same military-grade tear gas that had nearly suffocated them 10 minutes ago. The men on the roof were dead, but Matteo smelled like he had been standing right next to them when the gas was deployed. Maya's blood ran colder than the freezing air. She remembered Dante's words from the dark. Matteo. He was my second in command. He sold the security codes. Dante had assumed Matteo orchestrated it from afar. He did not realize Matteo was leading the strike team himself. Matteo reached into his tactical vest, but he did not pull out a medical kit. He pulled out a suppressed 9mm pistol. "It is a terrible tragedy, boss," Matteo whispered, raising the barrel of the gun and pointing it directly at Dante's chest. "The assassins breached the elevator before we could reach you. You fought bravely. The family will mourn you." Dante's eyes widened, the absolute betrayal shattering his fading composure. He tried to lunge forward, but his shattered body refused to obey. He was completely defenseless. Maya did not think. She simply reacted. The primal, violent instinct that Dante had awakened inside her took total control. Mounted on the brass wall, less than 2 feet from her shoulder, was a heavy industrial fire extinguisher. Maya grabbed the metal cylinder with both hands, ripped it from its bracket, and hurled it directly at Matteo's chest with every ounce of desperate strength she possessed. The heavy metal tank slammed into Matteo, knocking him backward just as he pulled the trigger. The suppressed gunshot went wide, shattering the glass panel inches from Dante's head. Matteo stumbled, dropping the gun. Maya did not wait for him to recover. She grabbed the emergency release pin on the fire extinguisher she had just thrown and yanked it out. A massive, blinding white cloud of pressurized chemical foam erupted into the confined space of the elevator, completely engulfing Matteo and his armed guards in a suffocating, zero-visibility fog. "Move!" Maya screamed, grabbing Dante by the lapels of his coat and hauling him upward. Fueled by a sudden, massive surge of adrenaline, Dante forced himself to his feet. Leaning his entire weight on Maya, they stumbled out of the shattered elevator and into the chaotic, foam-filled hallway of the 14th floor. Behind them, Matteo was coughing violently, blindly swinging his arms as he tried to find his weapon in the thick white smoke. "Do not let them get to the stairwell!" Matteo roared to his men. Maya dragged Dante toward the heavy steel fire door at the end of the corridor. Dante was leaving a thick trail of blood on the pristine carpet, his breaths coming in ragged, wet gasps. They reached the heavy door. Maya pushed it open, hauling Dante into the cold, concrete stairwell. She turned back to pull the door shut, but a heavy tactical boot wedged itself into the gap. Matteo drove his shoulder against the steel, his face contorted in absolute, murderous rage. His right arm, gripping a combat knife, thrust through the opening, slashing blindly at Maya's face. Maya dodged the blade by a fraction of an inch, the cold steel slicing through the fabric of her shoulder. Matteo was stronger. He was pushing the door open, his eyes locking onto hers with lethal intent. Maya looked down. Right next to the door frame was the heavy hydraulic release lever for the emergency fire doors. It was designed to slam the 2,000-pound steel doors shut in the event of an inferno, crushing anything in its path to seal off oxygen. Matteo sneered, pushing his head and shoulder through the gap. "You are just a delivery girl," he spat, raising the knife to plunge it into her neck. "I am the surgeon," Maya whispered. She reached up and yanked the red hydraulic lever down with all her might. The massive steel door slammed shut with the catastrophic force of a freight train. It caught Matteo's extended right arm directly between the steel frame and the heavy door. The sickening sound of bone shattering echoed through the stairwell. Matteo let out a blood-curdling scream of absolute agony as his radius and ulna were instantly pulverized. The combat knife dropped from his useless, mangled hand, clattering onto the concrete floor. Maya kicked the knife away, her hazel eyes completely devoid of mercy as she watched the traitor collapse backward into the hallway, screaming as he clutched his destroyed arm. The heavy door locked into place with a definitive, metallic thud, sealing them safely inside the stairwell. Maya leaned against the cold concrete wall, her chest heaving, her hands covered in white foam and fresh blood. She looked down at the crushed bone and blood smeared across the steel door frame. She had just crippled the second most dangerous man in the city. She turned her head. Dante was sitting on the concrete stairs, his hand pressing against his bleeding chest. He was looking at her. The shock of betrayal was gone from his eyes, replaced by a dark, consuming awe. The delivery girl was dead. Standing before him, bathed in the dim emergency lights of the stairwell, was a queen forged in blood and steel. "Let us go find a hospital," Maya said, picking up the discarded combat knife. "Our 15 minutes are almost up. 3 months is exactly 90 days. In the criminal underworld, 90 days is more than enough time for a wounded king to reclaim his throne and drown his enemies in their own ambition." The private, subterranean medical facility beneath the Romano estate was deathly quiet. The air smelled faintly of bleach, expensive cedar wood, and cold steel. Standing in the center of the surgical theater was Maya. She was not wearing a soaked yellow delivery jacket. She wore a sleek, perfectly tailored black surgical blouse. The terrified medical student was dead and buried. In her place stood the only woman in Boston who held the pulse of the syndicate in the palm of her hand. The heavy automatic doors of the theater slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Dante Romano walked into the room. He wore a charcoal suit, the dark fabric clinging flawlessly to his broad shoulders. There was no trace of the dying man from the elevator, save for a faint, jagged scar resting perfectly over his heart. His dark, predatory eyes locked onto Maya, the familiar, consuming fire burning in their depths. Behind him, 2 massive guards dragged a broken, trembling figure into the blinding white light of the operating room. Matteo. His right arm was a twisted, useless mess of fused bone and metal plates, a permanent reminder of the 2,000-pound fire door that had crushed his betrayal. He was thrown violently onto the cold, stainless steel operating table. Heavy leather straps were instantly buckled across his chest, wrists, and ankles, pinning him down completely. Matteo looked up, his eyes widening in absolute terror as he recognized the woman standing over him. Dante approached the table, his footsteps echoing rhythmically against the polished tile. He did not look at the traitor. He stood directly behind Maya. She felt the radiating heat of his chest against her back, a familiar, dark anchor that sent a shiver down her spine. His large, warm hand reached forward, gently grasping her wrist, guiding her fingers as she picked up a gleaming, titanium scalpel from the sterilized tray. "You said you were the surgeon," Dante whispered, his voice a low, lethal rumble that vibrated against her ear. His lips brushed against her neck, sending a shockwave of adrenaline straight to her heart. Matteo thrashed against the heavy leather straps, his voice cracking as he begged. "Boss, please. I served you for 15 years. You cannot let her do this." Dante's grip on Maya's waist tightened, a possessive, unbreakable hold. He did not even acknowledge the rat screaming on the table. "He took everything from you, Maya," Dante continued, his breath hot against her skin, intoxicating and dangerous. "He built the cage. He dropped the gas. He forced you to become exactly what you are right now." Maya looked down at the trembling man strapped to the steel table. She felt the cold titanium of the scalpel in her hand and the absolute, terrifying power of the Mafia Boss standing behind her. She was no longer a victim paying off a debt. She was the queen of the underworld, and this was her domain. Maya flipped the scalpel flawlessly between her fingers, the surgical steel catching the harsh overhead light. Her hazel eyes were entirely devoid of mercy. "Anesthesia is for patients, Matteo," Maya whispered, her voice colder than the room itself. "You were just a procedure." Dante smiled, a dark, devastating curve of his lips against her skin. He kissed the side of her neck, stepping back just enough to give her the room she needed. "The surgery is yours, my queen," Dante murmured into the shadows. As Maya lowered the blade, the terrified screams of the traitor echoed through the subterranean halls, a brutal, perfect symphony for the reborn king and his dark savior. If you felt your heart racing during this intense survival romance, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Leave a comment below telling me what you would have done if you were trapped in that elevator with the Mafia Boss, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another dark and thrilling story.